Welcome back to the channel. I'm Traben, and in today's video, we're looking at the best and worst of 2023. I've set aside some books here, and in no particular order, we're going to just talk about some of the highlights of 2023, and then we're going to talk about some of the biggest disappointments, some of the books that were either the lowest rated or there was something about them that just was not what I was hoping for. This is not in any kind of order. I'm just going to start pulling from the stack and talk about what was great about these books, what was terrible about these books. We're going to start with At Home with the Horrors by Sammy Scott. So this was probably the best short story collection I read this year. One of the better horror books in general that I read. I didn't feel like any of the stories in here were real misses, possibly with the possible exception of the very last one. Last story was a little bit too lengthy and was a little bit too reminiscent of the Babadook. There was something enjoyable about every other story in here. If you're looking for a horror short story collection, I think this is a great one to pick up. Up next, I have Six Crimson Cranes. So there was a lot I liked about this book, and this really stands out to me as one of the strongest YA titles that I read this year. From its engaging characters, its blend of various fantasy and folklore stories from different cultures, and it's a very poignant ending. I've talked about this book at least twice on my channel, in addition to whatever wrap-up it showed up in. And so I do feel like this one really stood out to me amid all of the YA titles that I picked up this year. So really enjoyed this one. This one I have is Benjamin Stevenson's Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone. So this one, I picked this up because I had heard it compared to Knives Out, which is one of my favorite films. And I really enjoyed the setup of this story, meta-narrative it's couched in, where the author is explaining to you that there are certain rules for telling a murder mystery story, certain classical rules, and he is going to abide by those rules. One of the more interesting aspects of it, and something that's revealed very quickly when you pick up this book, is that every single death in the book is announced in the very beginning. It tells you what page numbers all the different deaths are going to occur in. I've never read a mystery book with that kind of framing device, and it really worked. It was very clever and very engaging. If you're the kind of person who feels like they've got to figure out the whodunit, I feel like this one would be a challenge. I recommend that you pick it up if you are a fan of murder mystery at all. Next up, we have My Best Friend's Exorcism. So I picked up this book almost immediately after finishing Grady Hendrix's first novel, which was Horror Store, and this was his second book. And so now I'm kind of inclined to just continue picking up Grady Hendrix books in publication order. My Best Friend's Exorcism was one of the more entertaining horror stories that I've read this year. I really liked the way that Hendrix was able to weave in the horror elements, some comedy bits, a heavy dose of 80s nostalgia, which of course is going to mostly work for me. I'm more of a child of the 90s, but I do recognize a lot of the pop culture elements that are presented in the book, and also just tell like a really sweet story about friendship. Hendrix does have this tendency to kind of drag on the ending a little bit, and this is no exception, at least with the few books that I've read so far. So far, Grady Hendrix is 2 for 2 for me. Horror Store is great. My Best Friend's Exorcism was even better, and so I wanted to highlight it as one of the better horror stories that I read this year. Do A Powerbomb. So this one I picked up because it was the Eisner Award winner for this year. And I had read a little bit about it, but man, I was not prepared for how off the wall this comic gets. Everything in this comic, from the art to the storyline, the characters, it's another one of these books that is firing on all cylinders, is doing everything so well. It's a story about family. It's a story about um, pro wrestling. It's a story about grief and loss. Um, because so much of the action centers around these WWE, WCW style fights with, in certain cases, these outlandish characters, the frenetic energy of the art does so much to really sell the action and sell the impact and sell the blows that are being dealt in these fights. And that same energy, that same art style is used to also deliver the emotional beats of the story. And so I felt like, again, this is one of those books that everything is working together so well. Everything came together so nicely. Um, you have to have a healthy dose of suspension of disbelief. You have to go into this book like being okay with it getting very ridiculous, especially toward the climax of the story. But I feel like if you are the kind of person who can do that, if you are uh, someone who has watched like Dragon Ball Z or any of these like uh, high energy manga or anime, and that's something that you feel like you can tolerate, you don't need to have a super realistic story. Um, this is an excellent read, and it does have, in a similar vein to my best friend's Exorcism, it does have at its core a very moving message about loss and grief and family. So it's another one that I would highly recommend people pick up if you haven't already heard about it or haven't already given it a shot. What a break. Ugh. Now, what am I going to do tomorrow when it's my job to talk? Next title I wanted to talk about was Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. So this was one of the Brandon Sanderson secret projects for this year. And I know a lot of people will put Tress of the Emerald Sea as their number one. But for me, it's going to be Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. There is a lot in the middle of this book where not a whole lot is happening, where it is running very slow, and it's very hard to see where the story is going to end up. But I thought it was so compelling to have these two characters that are telling this simultaneous fish out of water story, because the central, one of the central conflicts, one of the central problems of the book is switching bodies, but not quite in an equal way. Even that is just so like it starts up such an interesting mystery at the beginning of the book, and to see how they struggle in one another's world, because they come from vastly different backgrounds, and to see they're like struggling to understand how the world that they've been thrust into works, how to balance between wanting to do what they've always done in the past, like their attitude, their worldview, and what's best for the person whose body they're inhabiting or whose world that they've been thrown into, was all really interesting. If you have not had the chance to take a look at it yet, it would be my highest recommendation from the Brandon Sanderson Secret Projects for this year. Next up, we're going to talk about This Is How You Lose the Time War. Now, this is one that I read, I think, in one or two sittings early on in the year. There's a lot that has escaped me, because I feel like a good bit of this book is fairly high concept. it's about two characters who are in a time war with each other. They're on opposite sides of this war that rages across the galaxy or across the universe. They're able to time travel. They're able to travel to all these different crazy planets, and they start off like with a rivalry, um, and it ends up in something completely different. And the fact that two authors penned this uh, penned this novel. One writes for one of the characters, one writes for the other. The entire thing is epistolary, like it's letters back and forth between the two characters. Um, or it's primarily epistolary. I think there are some like interludes where they like find the letter, but just the creativity with what can you do if time is meaningless? How do you stop a war that's been going forever? Um, and just the relationship building in this book, I think, is really compelling. Those concepts definitely stuck with me. I think a reread would be beneficial, like knowing where the story's heading a little bit, understanding the concept, because it does kind of drop you in and you have to acclimate very quickly to a lot of these really difficult concepts. So um, this is topping a lot of people's lists for 2023, and for good reason. I'd highly recommend if you're a sci-fi fan, um, a fantasy fan, if you like uh, Alistair Reynolds, I think would be a good comparison here, like that kind of speculative science fiction. Uh, this is one that I would definitely recommend you pick up. Next one we're going to talk about is Something is Killing the Children. I think the most recent arc is the strongest, and I really enjoy um, everything about this comic. This is one of several comics penned by James Tynion IV that I read this year, and he is quickly becoming my favorite comic book writer. Pretty much everything I've read from him has been great. Um, is such creative concepts. Um, Again, really interesting characters. Uh, Fantastic world building, and with Something is Killing the Children, I think Tinian has found a universe that he wants to explore to the fullest extent. So we have Something is Killing the Children, then we have an offshoot comic book series called House of Slaughter, which is exploring more of the lore behind the characters. Um, for those who don't know what this is about, this is basically about monsters are real, and only children can see them. There is a society of monster hunters that go about dealing with these threats and either trying to save people or trying to kill monsters, depending on the person or the group, what their priority is. And the main book, Something is Killing the Children, follows Erica Slaughter from the House of Slaughter, and she's kind of rebelling against a lot of the assertions that the group is making. It's just really cool monster concepts, really amazing world building, a really deep lore if you're willing to put in the time to uh, read the main story and read the supplementary comics. Um, and so one of the more interesting and engaging worlds that I looked at in 2023. Next up, we have a couple of books. We have Legends and Lattes by Baltree, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. So these are both on my list for introducing me to cozy fantasy. which is not something that I knew that I needed. And I read Legends and Lattes earlier in the year. I want to say I was reading this around Valentine's Day because I know I used this for my Valentine's lesson last year. Um, and I really liked it. I liked the idea of um, just a fantasy world, but we're not dealing with like end of the world threats. We're just dealing with someone who wants to open up a coffee shop and, retire and try to live a peaceful life. And I thought that was a really interesting concept and a really fun one. It was realized in a way that I feel really worked and was cozy and fun. And then from picking up Legends and Lattes, I heard about the Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. These were getting compared a lot with that same kind of cozy fantasy story. And um, I don't feel like the Secret Society of Irregular Witches was quite as successful as Legends and Lattes, but I still had a good time reading it, and it was another one where the stakes weren't super high. The biggest conflict is a rather personal one, and um, I liked the characters and the romance enough that it was just a really comfortable read. So yeah, I'd recommend both of these if you want to dip into cozy fantasy. If you're tired of every book being the world is ending and we've got to deal with this apocalyptic threat, then those are both titles that are good alternatives for that style of storytelling. I have Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. My students were doing nonfiction book clubs for the fall semester, and so I attempted to read most of the books that we had set out for them. Born a Crime was my favorite. So Trevor Noah is a fairly well-known stand-up comedian and host of The Daily Show. He talks about his growing up in South Africa during apartheid, hence the title of the book, Born a Crime. But he tells these stories of his growing up that are at once so crazy, um, so entertaining, but also deliver the deliver an important message about acceptance, about the way that we communicate with each other, about the dangers of racism, the dangers of segregation, but all through the lens of someone who is very comfortable telling stories and someone who is very good at injecting humor and comedy even into these very serious situations. So, if you are looking for a nonfiction book, this is one that I would recommend. And lastly, for my highlights, I have Bunny Mask. Mask centers around the titular character, who is the nearest thing I can equate it to would be the feeling of the elder gods in Cthulhu. This kind of cosmic horror in the shape of a woman with a bunny mask, um, who is so far beyond like mortal understanding that there are times when the things she says are super creepy, and there are times where they're super funny. Like, she'll pause when she's saying these absolutely insane things and just be like, I don't think I'm very good at explaining things. And so this book managed to weave together very interesting lore, a compelling story again, but also it just has this. There's something about the monster. There's something about the villain that's just very interesting. I don't see a lot in other media. In Paul Tobin's introduction, he talks about how he wanted to create a monster that felt like it was doing the right thing, and possibly was doing the right thing. Um, but that was always unclear. And so I feel like that's what's so compelling about it is Bunny Mask doesn't seem evil, but is so disinterested in like human emotion, human uh, events, that the things that she says sound completely insane. The things that she does and like threatens people with are so crazy. The lore is also teased out in a way that obscures a lot of information for the reader, but I never felt like it was um, frustrating. It was just interesting to go along for the ride and to try to figure out what's really going on, to try to figure out the mysteries behind some of what was happening in the book. But for me, the reason why I keep coming back to this one, the reason why I keep reading it, and the reason why I so desperately want to have a third volume uh, announced is because of the titular character and just their um, completely bizarre personality that, again, I don't think I've seen in very many horror villains or horror monsters. So another high recommendation for me, probably the number one comic that I would recommend for 2023. Um, and it's not getting a lot of buzz. It's not getting a lot of attention on the best of list for this year, but it would be my number one. So one that I'm definitely pushing and uh, want people to go check out. All right, we've talked about all the highlights for this year, all the hits. Let's talk about some misses. And again, these are not necessarily my worst books of 2023, but they're definitely ones that I had some major problem with, or something that just definitely didn't work for me. We're going to start with Another Castle. So I bought this along with a bunch of other comics when my local comic book store was having this insane 75% off sale. So like books were like $3. And so we just got a huge stack of books, and a good number of them were great. I thought Another Castle would be fun because it seemed like kind of flipping a lot of the tropes of damsel in distress and um, fantasy stories going all the way back to like He-Man and She-Ra kind of feel to it. Um, and I mean, I guess it kind of did that a little bit, but my issue with this one was the characters were so flat and one dimensional. Um, the princess is definitely like self assured, and she's definitely going to go after the villain. Um, but there was no like, I don't know, there's no nuance to anything. There was no depth to this character. It did invert a lot of the tropes that you would expect to see in a fantasy novel or something like even like Mario or Zelda. It kept the like cookie cutter characters, the very bland villain, these side characters that didn't really seem to matter other than to be propped up to show like how silly these tropes are in mainstream fiction. And so because it didn't have anything more to it than just like flipping these characters, it was a real disappointment for me. Also on this list is Witchblood. I don't think I rated Witchblood super low. It was probably a 3-star ultimately, but it just was something that whenever I went to my comic book shop, there were a bunch of ads about it. I feel like there was a lot of buzz around this book when it was coming out. And when I read it, it was just another one of these, like, it felt really disjointed. It was not what I was hoping it would be. Um, Again, I can't remember much about what happened in this book. Like, it tried to set up try to do a little bit of world building, try to set up some like background on these characters. Yeah, it just was not what I was hoping for, especially given like the hype that I felt like preceded it. Um, it was something that I felt like I had high expectations for. I thought this was going to be another like 5-star read, and it disappointed me. So while I might not be able to very accurately articulate why Witchblood was not doing it for me, I can say with confidence that The Rise of Ultraman was a disappointment because I know the writers of this book are capable of doing more. This is written by Kyle Higgins and Matt Grom, both of whom I know are um, big fans of Tokusatsu and Power Rangers, Super Sentai. I believe both of them worked on uh, the Power Rangers books. I believe both are involved in the Massive Verse, which I love so much. I made a video of that as well. Um, and so I don't know what happened here. The Rise of Ultraman was so forgettable and tried to hold back so much information, like tried to develop this mystery in this first volume, and it just didn't work. It was kind of the opposite of what I was saying with Bunny Mask, where the withholding of information just frustrates me, and I'm not sure what they're trying to go for with this story. uh, I don't have plans to pick up more volumes at the moment because this book did nothing for me. But I suppose if I heard that it was getting better, if I suppose that if I heard the plot was coming together more coherently, I'd pick up another volume. But again, like I don't know what it was. I really expected this to be a slam dunk. I've been watching a lot of Ultraman content recently. Um, and it was just really disappointing that this comic just didn't do anything for me. Just didn't work. All right, now we're getting to actual like low ratings. So I mentioned in my stats video that I only had 2 books that were 2-star ratings, and one of those was uh, Sally Hepworth's The Soulmate. I read this as part of a book troupe read. Nothing about this worked for me. There was a perspective character in here that I felt was deeply problematic from a storytelling perspective, caused some real problems for like raising questions of why didn't they know things later on in the story. Um, I felt like the ending was not only problematic, but potentially very dangerous and the message it was sending, and also went counter to one of the character's core beliefs, like something that this character felt very strongly about was completely undone by the end of the book in this like final act. Um, I didn't like any of the characters. I didn't feel like the mystery was very compelling either. So just like nothing was working in this book. It's one of these stories where this person's talking about how great their relationship is and how wonderful their husband is, and over the course of the story, you over the course of the story, you learn that that's not the case, that the relationship's actually terrible and incredibly toxic. And that's not fun. I don't feel like that's an interesting story. The mystery was meh. I didn't feel like there was anything really surprising about what happened, like the reveals that were being made. And it's also a problem in that the reveals that are made in the book are not revelations for the characters. They're just for you. Like the characters already know what's happened. The characters already know this like background information. You're just learning it. And so there was something that was not fun about that, not compelling about that. Also a lot of really convoluted coincidental things that just happened to work out a certain way that felt really unbelievable. And so just a mix of all those together, this was probably the weakest thriller mystery book I read this year. All right, next up we have The House Witch, which was another one of these books that came up in the same circles, the same conversations as the Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches and Legends and Lattes, as this was meant to be a cozy fantasy story. And I felt like this really needed an editor, for a number of different reasons. There is some very infantile, crass humor in here. There is some perspective shift problems that really undercut some of what's going on. You can't build romantic tension when you have a character who's like, oh, I wonder if they understand what I mean. Oh, I'm so nervous about how they're taking this. And then you immediately jump in to the other character's perspective and they're like, oh, yeah, I really like this guy. He seems pretty nice. And I don't know why he's so nervous around me. It's just like, it makes it even more frustrating because you're not building any like mystery or tension, or you're not letting anything build. Like as soon as there's a hint of uh like will they, won't they, or like are these characters really interested in each other, it just jumps to the other character and lets that you know that they're also interested in this relationship. And so no worries, nothing, no conflict, don't worry about that. The backdrop of the story also includes some political intrigue, which I feel like really undercuts the uh, cozy fantasy tropes or the cozy fantasy genre. I don't want to read cozy fantasy for these uh, you know, global catastrophes or this political intrigue. I want to read it for the romance story, or like the just like the everyday challenges this character is having to overcome. And so I feel like there were elements of it that worked. I feel like the relationship could have worked had we edited out a little bit of the shift between the two characters. I feel like the trying to disguise his nature as a witch could have worked and been fun, but the book does so much to sabotage itself with these ridiculous chapters, these really crass jokes. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the cat chapters, in which the main character's cat is apparently a noir detective cat. It's the weirdest choice, I think, in any book I've read this year. It was so out of left field. Those chapters did not need to exist. I did not need the cat to have an inner monologue and have other cat characters that just they don't matter, and it's just so bizarre. This book didn't know what it wanted to be, and what I wanted it to be was maybe a third of it. So it was just incredibly disappointing. Finally, my other 2-star read, so my other really low rated book this year, is Gone to See the Riverman. So I read this for the Magical Readathon. In that readathon, I was trying to pick out a lot of books that dealt with demons and the occult, because that's kind of what my character's background dealt with. And so it was just a happy accident, a happy coincidence that I happened to get this book, because the prompt for this book was just go on to Bookstagram, and the first book you see, that's what you're going to read. And I went on to Instagram, and the first thing I saw was actually Down the River of Blood, which is the sequel to this book. So I follow a number of horror YouTubers and horror Instagram content creators, and uh, this book rates fairly highly with a number of them, and so I thought I'd give it a shot and see how it went. I was aware that this was part of the extreme horror genre and was curious to see how I would respond to that. And the answer is not well. Not well at all. I did not like the characters in this. I felt like it was like super gross to like an absurd degree, both in its descriptions of like decaying bodies and gore, but also just like with the characters themselves, with their behaviors, with their backstories. They were just all super horrible people. And the biggest issue I have from a storytelling perspective is, despite this being basically a twisted version of like the hero's journey, like there's a definite journey down the river to try to find the mysteries of who the Riverman is. The core idea of that kind of story, or really any story, is that your characters need to change. Who the character is at the end of the book needs to be different than who the character is at the beginning of the book. And that does not happen here. The main character of this story is a terrible human being at the beginning of the book. They are a terrible human being at the end. They learn nothing. They do not develop as a character. It is on the shorter side, so that is at least one mercy that it afforded me, is that I didn't have to read a super long, 300-page novel to wrap up this story. But no, this just did not do it for me. The like gross aspects aside, I think I could have been okay with that had there been any kind of story here, but there's not. And so all those things compounding together just made it probably the worst thing I read this year. If there's one positive thing that came out of reading this, it's that this is not a subgenre for me. I will stick with horror, but I'm not going to dip my toe into extreme horror. Certainly not going to read the sequel to this book. And that is my look at the best and worst of 2023. As always, I hope your reading journey is going well. Pop your recommendations or your biggest disappointments down in the comments below. Let me know what you enjoyed reading in 2023, what I should avoid in the future. Please like, comment, subscribe so we can grow this corner of our BookTube community. And until the next one, take care.